Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and in this segment we're going to begin an update on the assassination of President Kennedy. There have been a number of journalistic developments over the last several years pursuant to the release of the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, and a flurry of legislative attempts, some of them successful, at obliging U.S. government officialdom to release any of the information that had not been released to date. As I said, those efforts have been partially successful, and Oliver Stone's efforts have been extremely successful, at least in drawing people's attention once again to the assassination of President Kennedy. And there has been no shortage of new journalistic developments vis-a-vis the investigation, albeit 33 years now, or almost 33 years after President Kennedy's assassination. I'm recording this, by the way, on June 20th of 1996 for those who eventually hear this program on tape. Research credit on this first article goes to a listener, and this article concerns the alleged recruitment of a Green Beret back in the mid-1960s to murder William Pitzer, who was a lieutenant commander at Bethesda Naval Hospital and one of the individuals involved in the Bethesda Hospital autopsy, or alleged autopsy might be a better way of putting it, on President Kennedy. This former Green Beret, a fellow named Dan Marvin, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin, maintains that he was recruited along with a colleague of whom there is no official record, at least according to U.S. military records, to kill Mr. Pitzer. According to Dan Marvin, this Green Beret, the alleged attempt at recruiting both Marvin or a colleague, Mr. Vanek, or Vanek, V-A-N-E-K, to kill William Pitzer was under the auspices of William Pitzer being a traitor who was disseminating information or selling information, quote, secrets, unquote, to the enemy. We now know, of course, this was not the case, and the former Green Beret, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin, didn't think much of this particular attempt at recruitment, or alleged attempt at recruitment, by an unnamed CIA fellow. But years later, while watching a PBS special on the Kennedy assassination, an accounting of the names, or a recounting of the names of people who had been associated with the case and had died violently was listed. And then Dan Marvin saw the name of William Pitzer, the man in charge of the Kennedy autopsy records at Bethesda. Here's the story of what may be yet another chapter in the official investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. As far as I know, the story told by Dan Marvin has never been confirmed or denied. Of course, the fact that Lieutenant Commander Pitzer turned up dead, an alleged suicide, certainly reinforces the credibility of this account. Of course, it does not confirm it. Research credit once again on this goes to a listener. This is from the Ithaca Journal of November 16th, 1995, specifically from the Ithaca Journal, the City and Towns section of the Ithaca Journal. It's listed on page 3A, according to this annotation. The article is by Franklin Crawford, C-R-A-W-F-O-R-D, of the Ithaca Journal staff. It's headlined, Local Man Tells JFK Story, subtitled, History Channel Includes Marvin in 6-part series. It may just be his story, or it could be history. In either case, retired Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin's relationship to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy is intriguing. His association with the assassination story that won't die is revealed during a national TV broadcast Sunday night. Marvin, a former Green Beret trained in guerrilla warfare, assassination, and terrorist tactics, appears in the History Channel's coming documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Truth Shall Make You Free. The last of a 6-part series produced by Nagell Turner, the 1-hour TV broadcast airs at 9 p.m. Sunday and again at 9 p.m. November 24th. In it, Marvin, an Ithaca resident, relates his account as a Green Beret on, quote, the periphery of the Kennedy assassination, unquote. Speaking to the Journal on Tuesday, Marvin recalled an afternoon in 1965 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he and another Green Beret were summoned to meet a, quote, company man, unquote, someone from the Central Intelligence Agency. Marvin said the company man, standing under a group of pine trees, quote, asked if I would terminate William B. Pitzer, unquote, a lieutenant commander at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, because he was selling secrets to the enemy. The name meant nothing to Marvin at the time, and initially Marvin said he agreed to the assignment. But moments later he refused when he realized Pitzer was to be, quote, terminated, unquote, on American soil. That was something Marvin understood to be a no-no for Special Forces operatives like himself. Quote, I refused the mission once I was told it was in the U.S., he said, adding that the company then spoke to Marvin's colleague, a Captain David H. Vanek, or Vanek, V-A-N-E-K. Marvin said he doesn't know what happened between Vanek and the company man, but today he can find no information on Vanek, whom he hasn't seen since that day under the pines in 1965. Marvin produced a letter of inquiry with Vanek's name and military identification number to the U.S. Military Records Division in St. Louis, Missouri, and its response. There is no record of a Captain David H. Vanek. The plot thickened for Marvin in 1993 when he was watching a PBS special on the Kennedy assassination. Toward the end of the show, 42 names of people associated with the Kennedy case who died violently were listed. Among them, William B. Pitzer, the man in charge of the Kennedy autopsy records at Bethesda. Quote, when I saw that name, I about got sick in my living room, unquote, Marvin said. Pitzer died in his office at Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1966, and the official record of his death lists it as a suicide from a gunshot wound. Marvin has been in contact with Pitzer's wife, Joyce Pitzer, and has 2 recorded phone conversations with her. She was unable to get her husband's autopsy for 28 years. I think it should have been autopsy records. For 28 years, Marvin said. It is Marvin's personal recollections combined with his subsequent personal investigations into the Pitzer connection, which he says have been stymied by his wife's lawyer, that brought him into the History Channel documentary. More than 30 years later, the Kennedy issue is unresolved for Marvin, who says he wants, quote, just the truth. That's what we're shooting for, unquote. He is not alone. Marvin's greatest advocate throughout his quest for truth is Robert Palmer, the local cable access producer. He's the only one who stuck by me, Marvin said. And then it goes on to promote that particular special. Again, this is from the Ithaca Journal of November 16, 1995, page 3A. Local Man Tells JFK Story. Subtitled, History Channel Includes Marvin in 6-part series. It's by Franklin Crawford. Again, summing up, this article tells the story of then Lieutenant Colonel, or eventually Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin in the Green Beret, who maintains that he was contacted by a CIA man, a CIA officer, and that along with a colleague, a Captain David H. Vanek, or Vanek, V-A-N-E-K, about whom there is no official record in U.S. military records, the company man, quote-unquote, attempted to recruit them to kill a William Pitzer because he was supposedly selling secrets to the enemy. In fact, William Pitzer was apparently in charge of the autopsy records for the Kennedy assassination autopsy, or the second autopsy that took place at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Later, Marvin was watching a documentary about the Kennedy assassination, and in a listing of 42 names of people connected with the case who had died violently, he came across Pitzer's name, and at that point that reopened for him that entire experience. And as Marvin puts it, he just about got sick. Marvin initially refused the assignment because initially he accepted the assignment, then refused it when he realized that Pitzer was to be terminated on American soil, a no-no for an active duty Green Beret. There is no explanation provided here for the reason why Captain Vanek's name does not appear in official military records. Eventually, Pitzer died of a gunshot wound. He was listed as a suicide, and apparently his widow had been unable to obtain his autopsy records for some 28 years. So, with former Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin, the Kennedy assassination investigation, at least, winds or grinds onward. A new detail concerning FBI's attempts at keeping track of Lee Harvey Oswald well before he became a household name was recorded in the San Jose Mercury News of Friday, December 9th of 1995. The following is a Reuters story at State Line, Washington. It's headlined, FBI asked Swiss police to help track Oswald in 1960. The article reads as follows. 3 years before President Kennedy was assassinated, the FBI asked Swiss police to help track defector Lee Harvey Oswald, FBI documents released Thursday showed. Swiss police, at the FBI's request, investigated whether Oswald had followed through on a stated plan to attend Albert Schweitzer College in Churwalden, Switzerland, or whether an impersonator might have taken his place, the records showed. The answer to both questions was no, the Swiss concluded. Oswald, a former U.S. Marine who defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, was arrested in Dallas hours after shooting Kennedy, allegedly shooting Kennedy, on November 22, 1963. Oswald was shot dead by nightclub owner Jack Ruby 2 days later. In a hotly disputed finding, the presidentially appointed Warren Commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald, acting alone, killed Kennedy. But a House investigative panel concluded in 1979 that Kennedy was probably the victim of a conspiracy, and some researchers maintain any such plot would have involved one or more Oswald impersonators. By the way, I'm one of those in agreement with that. There were Oswalds, or people calling themselves Lee Harvey Oswald, turning up all over the American Southwest, doing all sorts of things that subsequently incriminated Lee Harvey Oswald. Continuing with the article, the newly released documents involve FBI contacts with Swiss police after Oswald renounced his U.S. citizenship at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow October 31, 1959. The Assassination Records Review Board in Washington is compiling records related to Kennedy's assassination. The FBI learned of Oswald's plan to study in Switzerland from his mother, who received the school's acceptance letter addressed to him at her home in Fort Worth, Texas. In an October 12, 1960 memorandum to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Paris quoted the Swiss police as saying Oswald never turned up at the school, and it was unlikely he had matriculated under a different name. The memo also said there was no record of, quote, a person possibly identical with the subject being registered for the semester that began October 2, 1960. But a November 3, 1960 follow-up memo quoted Swiss police as reporting Oswald sent a $25 deposit toward tuition in a letter dated June 19, 1959. So as to exactly what Oswald was doing at that school, whether there was an Oswald impersonator who matriculated there, or whether someone else calling himself Lee Harvey Oswald might have been doing other things, is not finally resolved, but there certainly is no official record concerning Lee Harvey Oswald and that alleged impersonator who may have impersonated him at that school, if in fact such a thing happened. I personally am not concerned with whether or not Oswald or a double went to that school, but rather there were people identifying themselves as Lee Harvey Oswald turning up all over the American Southwest in the months leading up to President Kennedy's assassination, including during times when Lee Harvey Oswald was proven to be elsewhere other than where these alleged Oswalds were turning up, and many of the behaviors they engaged in, or many of the things they did, subsequently went to make Lee Harvey Oswald appear to be the assassin that he was alleged to have been. It's also worth noting, however, that the FBI was taking interest in this alleged defector to the Soviet Union. I personally, along with many other researchers, feel that Lee Harvey Oswald was a U.S. intelligence operative and that his, quote, defection to, unquote, to the Soviet Union was engineered by whatever intelligence agency was running him. However, I do think that these documents that the FBI released are significant. It indicates that the FBI was taking an abiding interest in Lee Harvey Oswald years before he became the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, and in light of the kid glove treatment that was accorded Oswald by the national security establishment in the period between his return from the Soviet Union and his arrest for allegedly assassinating President Kennedy, although he was never charged with that. I think the kid gloves treatment accorded Lee Harvey Oswald demands closer scrutiny than it has received to date. By the way, for information about the Kennedy assassination, there are numerous archive shows available from Archives on Audio, including the Guns of November series, a number of installments of Radio Free America program number 37, RFA 15, and a number of miscellaneous archive shows dealing with the Kennedy assassination. Either at the end of this segment or at the end of the next half-hour segment, I will have some information about Archives on Audio. The movie JFK by Oliver Stone, of course, was based on the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination that was conducted by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. In a recently concluded 6-part interview with Ed Haslam, the author of Mary Ferry and the Monkey Virus, we once again touched on some of the New Orleans goings-on vis-a-vis Lee Harvey Oswald and the setting up of Oswald to look like a communist assassin who had killed President Kennedy. The Garrison probe which inspired the movie JFK, the Garrison probe which was to a considerable extent confirmed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which recommended to the U.S. Department of Justice that, among other things, they begin an investigation of David Ferry and the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans. That was who Jim Garrison was originally after. It was Garrison's ultimate vindication, despite all of the abuse that has been heaped upon Jim Garrison by the mainstream press and even the so-called alternative media. It's one of the reasons why I call them so-called. The Garrison probe, once again, has emerged in the news, and an account of that was carried in the San Francisco Examiner of Wednesday, February 14th of 1996. The following is an Associated Press story, Dateline New Orleans, and headlined, Documents Surface from Garrison Probe, subtitled, Jury Transcripts Get Their Custodian Thrown in Jail. So still, even in February of 1996, the Garrison probe is making news and still causing controversy. This article reads, As if the Kennedy assassination probe didn't have enough twists, here's a new one. A former investigator on the case has been thrown in jail for packing up secret grand jury transcripts in his trunk, keeping them hidden for 21 years, and then turning them over to a federal panel. Gary Raymond, R-A-Y-M-O-N-D, was taken into custody Tuesday after a judge gave him the maximum 6-month term for violating state grand jury secrecy laws. He was later released on bail pending an appeal. Raymond once worked for former New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who believed CIA hardliners had had President Kennedy assassinated in 1963 to keep the United States in Vietnam. In 1969, Garrison put businessman Clay Shaw on trial on charges of conspiring to kill Kennedy. The jury heard 34 days of testimony, then deliberated less than an hour before acquitting Shaw. By the way, what is not related here is that the jury concluded there had been a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. They just could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Clay Shaw was involved. It is also known now that Jim Garrison's investigation and his investigation into Clay Shaw was deliberately frustrated by elements of the U.S. intelligence community. Continuing with this article, again, from the San Francisco Examiner of Wednesday, 2/14/1996. Shortly after Harry Connick succeeded Garrison as district attorney in 1974, Connick ordered Raymond to destroy the records of Garrison's grand jury proceeding. Instead, Raymond put the files in his trunk, then kept them hidden for 21 years. He wasn't sure what to do with them until Connick told the Federal Assassination Records Review Board last June that the files had disappeared when Garrison left office. Quote, Not only is the man lying about these records, but he is trying to pin it on Garrison's people, unquote, Raymond said. Raymond went to WDSU TV reporter Richard Angelico, A-N-G-E-L-I-C-O, with the files and asked him to pass them on to the review board. Angelico did, but also went on the air with the names of the people who had testified 2 decades ago. Criminal District Judge Frank Marullo, M-A-R-U-L-L-O, who cited Raymond, said he would decide next week whether to hold Angelico in contempt. Raymond said he had gone to Angelico only because the reporter knew whom to contact on the review board. He said he had known nothing of Angelico's plan to report on the transcripts. The Federal Review Board now has the records and wants to release them, but is waiting for the courts to clear up their legal status, said board spokesman Tom Samoluk, S-A-M-O-L-U-K, and I may be mispronouncing some of these names. This article, in short, deals with the grand jury transcripts and grand jury records that pertain to Jim Garrison's investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy. Harry Connick, by the way, the father of Harry Connick Jr., the well-known singer, ordered the records of Garrison's grand jury proceedings destroyed, but Gary Raymond, one of Garrison's investigators, instead kept them locked up in his trunk. Connick, apparently, according to this article, told the Assassination Records Review Board last June, that would have been, by the way, in June of 1995, that the Garrison grand jury files had disappeared when Garrison left office. This apparently incurred the wrath of Gary Raymond, who accuses Harry Connick, the New Orleans DA, of lying, and also says that he was trying to shift the blame to Garrison's people. Again, that according to Gary Raymond, as quoted in this article. Raymond next went to WDSU TV reporter Richard Angelico with the files and asked him to pass them on to the review board. Angelico did, but also went on the air with the names of the people who had testified 2 decades ago. That certainly will not do much for secrecy concerning the ongoing investigation. It remains to be seen whether District Court Judge Frank Marullo, who cited Raymond, will hold Angelico in contempt. So at this point, the exact status of the records of Jim Garrison's grand jury investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald in the New Orleans area and into the Kennedy assassination, the exact status remains to be determined. There was, however, just this past week, a development that should be viewed as positive for those who would like to be able to glean any information that is valuable from those grand jury records. The Los Angeles Times of Monday, June 17th of 1996, carried the following short article in its Nation in Brief section. This is Dateline, Louisiana, and it's headlined, Judge Orders DA to Give Up JFK Files. A federal judge has ordered New Orleans District Attorney Harry Connick to turn over records on President Kennedy's assassination to a U.S. government agency. The ruling caps a bitter dispute between Connick and the U.S. Assassination Records Review Board, responsible for screening assassination documents and making public those that do not endanger national security. Connick argued that he should not be compelled to surrender documents gathered by his predecessor, the late Jim Garrison. Garrison's family, however, voluntarily handed over to the review board other assassination documents kept in his personal files. So a federal judge has now ordered, according to this article, current New Orleans DA Harry Connick, to turn over those records to the Assassination Records Review Board. One of the problems with the review board is that any documents that are deemed to be important to national security can be withheld from the public, and they are apparently giving various U.S. intelligence agencies veto power, in a sense, concerning what might damage national security. However, that glitch, I guess one could say, notwithstanding, it is encouraging to at least see some progress being made on some of the relevant documentation that is still being withheld concerning Kennedy's assassination, and I personally am very glad to see the Garrison grand jury records now at least potentially being released for public consumption. I have always felt that Jim Garrison got a very, very bad rap indeed with regard to the assassination of President Kennedy and his very heroic investigation into same. He was basically destroyed. In our next segment or two, we're going to be going back once again into the circumstances surrounding President Kennedy's assassination. We will be focusing at considerable length on the painting of Oswald red. We will be discussing CIA connections to Oswald. I do not personally believe that the CIA engineered the assassination of President Kennedy. However, I do believe that there were elements of the CIA involved, but at that time that they were involved, I believe they were dancing to the tune of a different master, I guess one could say. In fact, those elements of the CIA that appear to have been involved in Kennedy's assassination fell well to the right of the CIA as a whole. Again, I do not believe the CIA ordered the assassination of President Kennedy. I believe there were, as I said, elements of it involved, but they were operating on behalf of other agencies or other powers, well to the right of the CIA as a whole. I alluded to archive shows. Those are a form of radio documentary that I've put together over the years in which the printed sources upon which my lines of argument are based are presented, literally read on the air, so that listeners can tape the programs and use the resulting tapes as an audio study resource. These archive shows are available, as I say, from a tape duplication service. More on that tape duplication service right now.
All of Dave Emory's archive shows are available from a tape duplication service named Archives on Audio. They can be contacted at P.O. Box 170023, San Francisco, zip code 94117-0023. The phone number is 415-346-1840. Again, Archives on Audio can be reached at P.O. Box 170023, San Francisco, 94117-0023. The phone number, 415-346-1840. There is also a catalog available which lists all of the archive shows, gives a synoptic description of each show, and cross-references the programs with other broadcasts containing similar or related material. The Archives on Audio catalog is available on the KFJC webpage, which is reached at http://www.cygnus.com/KFJC/Emory. Again, the website, all lowercase letters, is http://www.cygnus.com/KFJC/Emory. The website also has a suggested reading list and a list of other sources to pursue for more information on this field of research. Neither Dave Emory nor KFJC gets money from this arrangement.
KFJC-FM, by the way, is the home base station on which I record these, or at which I record these programs. The half-hour segments that I've produced, including this, are not available from Archives on Audio. They're available from a different service called Spitfire. That's Spitfire. Their address is Box 1179, P.O. Box 1179. That's in Ben Lomond, California, capital B-E-N, capital L-O-M-O-N-D, zip code 95005. You can also contact them via email at alcalame@ix.netcom.com. Okay? That for Spitfire, they have the half-hour segments available. Those are not available from Archives on Audio. That concludes this segment. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and in this next segment we're going to continue a journalistic update of new developments in the investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy. In my personal opinion, the single most dramatic and probably the most important book to be written, or at least issued, in the aftermath of the movie JFK was Dick Russell's landmark book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, about former U.S. intelligence operative Richard Case Nagell, last name N-A-G-E-L-L. It's a huge book, and it not only covers Nagell's situation, but it covers a great many other aspects of the investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. That book was published in hardcover and softcover by Carolyn Graff, copyright 1992. And the author of that book, Dick Russell, last name R-U-S-S-E-L-L, is the author of a fascinating and very important article that appeared in High Times magazine, issue of March 1996. Research credit on this goes to a listener who sent this to me. In fact, a couple of different listeners sent this in, so research credit on this article goes to those listeners. Richard Case Nagell died under somewhat ambiguous circumstances shortly after the Assassination Records Review Board expressed interest in interviewing Nagell about his particular story. We are going to discuss the circumstances surrounding Richard Nagell's death, the even more important circumstances around his life, and the other information touched on by Dick Russell in this article entitled Oswald and the CIA. Again, from High Times Magazine's issue of March of 1996. And again, I want to briefly restate at the beginning of this reading of this article. I personally do not believe that the CIA ordered President Kennedy's assassination. I do feel that there were some elements of the CIA involved in the assassination, but that in all likelihood they were responding to a different master. They were in all likelihood working for a different agency and fell well to the right of the CIA as a whole and were dissatisfied with the CIA as a whole because of its policies, which they felt were too liberal. And again, that might appear crazy to the uninitiated, but in particular in the extremely polarized Cold War years of the early 1960s, there were people within the national security establishment, and a great many of them, who viewed the CIA as too liberal. And in my opinion, those elements of the CIA that appear to have been involved in Kennedy's assassination were responding to one of their less liberal mentors. We're going to begin reading now Dick Russell's Oswald and the CIA from High Times of March of 1996. The introduction to the article reads as follows. During the last 2 years, many long-suppressed files on Lee Harvey Oswald have finally been released. Evidence continues to grow on Oswald's connections to the most powerful secret police force in the world, the Central Intelligence Agency. This by Dick Russell. By the way, as sort of a parenthetical element, as an aside, the CIA is certainly very important and extremely dangerous. It is, however, a relatively minor element of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. The CIA only gets 15% of the U.S. intelligence budget, and according to my studies, the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, among other agencies, are at least as powerful, if not more powerful, and I believe the latter two are more powerful than the CIA proper. One never hears about them, however, or outfits like the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is extremely powerful. One hears about the CIA. And again, although it is very powerful and in its own way quite sinister much of the time, the CIA is a relatively minor portion of our intelligence system, and that should be borne in mind. Proceeding with Dick Russell's Oswald and the CIA, at 9 p.m. last November 1st, that would of course been of 1995, the landlord of a house in the Echo Park section of Los Angeles unsuccessfully tried the locks, then pried open a window and forced his way inside. Joe Motyka, M-O-T-Y-K-A, had been alerted by a neighbor that his tenant, 65-year-old Richard Case Nagell, had not been seen for several days. Motyka discovered the already decomposing body of Nagell in the bathroom and immediately alerted the police. Only the morning before in Washington, the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, mandated by Congress under the JFK Records Act of 1992 to review for public release all still-secret files on the John F. Kennedy assassination, had mailed Richard Nagell a letter. The board was seeking access to documentation he claimed to possess about a conspiracy to murder the 35th President of the United States. Although an autopsy performed by the L.A. County Coroner's Office determined that Nagell had died of a heart attack, the timing triggered alarm inside the ARRB. More than a month earlier, based upon testimony of this writer at a public hearing in Boston, ARRB executives had decided to pursue Nagell's private files and use their subpoena power to call him to testify. Upon hearing of his sudden death, the ARRB issued a subpoena for any records he may have kept in his house and flew an investigator to Los Angeles. What may surface next remains an open and very provocative question. As outlined in my 1992 book about Nagell, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Carroll and Graf Publishers, New York, the ex-military intelligence and CIA operative said he had made arrangements for certain, quote, smoking guns, unquote, to be divulged in the event of his death. These are likely to include a tape recording done surreptitiously by Nagell in the late summer of 1963, where at least 4 individuals, himself, Lee Harvey Oswald, and 2 Cuban exiles, plotted the assassination of President Kennedy. A photograph of Nagell and Oswald, which Nagell had a vendor take in New Orleans' Jackson Square, was said to be stashed in a bank vault in Zurich, Switzerland. In summary, what Nagell has chosen to reveal about his role in the conspiracy goes like this. Under contract to the CIA, he undertook an assignment as a, quote, double agent, unquote, who would cooperate with Soviet intelligence beginning in the autumn of 1962. Under KGB instructions from Mexico City, for a year he monitored discussions among a group of embittered Cuban exiles who were seeking to assassinate Kennedy and make it look as though Fidel Castro's Cuba was behind it. He was immediately asked to keep an eye on Lee Harvey Oswald, recently returned to America after his alleged, quote, defection, unquote, to the USSR. Oswald was brought into the conspiracy in July of 1963, deceived into thinking he was working for Castro. Soviet intelligence ordered Nagell either to convince Oswald he was being set up to take the rap, or to kill him in Mexico City before the assassination could transpire. While both U.S. and Soviet intelligence agencies were aware of the conspiracy, it was the KGB, not the CIA or FBI, that attempted to prevent it. The Soviets, who had reached a growing accommodation with Kennedy after the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, were also afraid that the assassination would be falsely blamed upon them or the Cubans. Nagell, instead of carrying out his assignment, sent a registered letter to the FBI, for which he also served as a confidential informant. Nagell, instead of carrying out his assignment, sent a registered letter to FBI, which he also served as a confidential informant, Director J. Edgar Hoover, more than 2 months before the tragedy in Dallas, providing enough information to warrant the arrest of Oswald and 2 Cuban exiles. While the Bureau says it cannot locate any such letter in its files, it is likely that Nagell kept a copy and the registered mail receipt among his effects. Also alerting CIA officials of the plot, Nagell then walked into a bank in El Paso, Texas on September 20th, 1963, fired 2 shots into the wall, and intentionally had himself placed in federal custody. He hinted to me in a series of meetings that right-wing extremists, including wealthy Texas oil interests and CIA renegades, were ultimately behind the assassination. Considerable documentation, including a notebook seized by the FBI upon Nagell's arrest that contained listings remarkably similar to Oswald's own notebook, already lends credibility to his story. Yet he was ignored by both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The new ARRB thus became the first official government body to express an interest in what he might be able to reveal. And like Oswald's friend George de Mohrenschildt, who allegedly committed suicide hours before a House Select Committee investigator was to see him in 1977, suddenly Nagell was dead. Previously unavailable files released so far through the ARRB's process have already raised more questions about a high-level cover-up surrounding Nagell. After his arrest in El Paso, he was held without a trial for 9 months in a county jail, where the FBI and Secret Service visited him on several occasions after the assassination. Although no mention is made of Nagell in the Warren Commission's 26 volumes, FBI reports from December of 1963 clearly state that he talked of having known Oswald in Texas and Mexico City. Transcripts of assassination-related telephone conversations with President Lyndon Johnson show that his friend Homer Thornberry, Thornberry, a federal judge who had been a Texas congressman, was in touch with LBJ twice in the weeks following the assassination. Then, late in January of 1964, Thornberry suddenly stepped in as the new judge in the Nagell case, where court transcripts indicated a concerted effort to suppress Nagell's efforts to describe his true motive for his alleged, quote, attempted bank robbery, unquote. Thornberry handed down the maximum sentence upon Nagell's conviction in June of 1964, a conviction that was later overturned on appeal. Nagell was released from prison in the spring of 1968. Flying to Europe shortly thereafter, where he was arrested on a train by East German authorities and held for 4 months behind the then, quote, Iron Curtain, unquote, before being released to U.S. authorities at the Berlin border. Long before this, according to a just classified March 20, 1964 CIA file, the agency was pursuing the significance of 6 names of his CIA employees found in the Nagell notebook taken by the FBI in September of 1963. Another CIA memorandum, dated July 20, 1963, out of its Mexico City station, tells of an American using the name Eldon Henson, Hensen, who wanted to establish contact with the Cuban embassy there. Having picked up the information via a telephone tap, the CIA then dispatched someone posing as a Cuban embassy officer to lure Henson to a hotel restaurant. The file describes Henson's expressed willingness to, quote, help Castro government in U.S. willing travel, has many good contacts in states, can move things from one place to another, unquote, which carries overtones of Nagell's own, quote, double, unquote, role. Author John Newman in Oswald and the CIA, his 1995 book based upon the recently released files, uses this incident to highlight the CIA's capability to, quote, enter surreptitiously into someone's life to control or manipulate it, unquote, a scenario Newman cites as a precursor to the agency's shenanigans when Oswald paid visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City 2 months later. What Newman fails to mention in the significance of the CIA file stating that Henson, quote, agreed accept phone call with keyword Laredo as call from deleted contact, unquote. In one of my interviews with Nagell in 1978, he discussed his own use of the same code name, Laredo, when making contact with Soviet intelligence. When I last spoke with Nagell in April of 1994 and gave him Henson's physical description, he said only, quote, that fits somebody I'd run into at the time, unquote. Asked why he chose not to mention Nagell in his book, Newman responded, quote, my methodology made that impossible. If it wasn't in the new documents, it didn't make it into my manuscript. I wanted to keep everything focused on the CIA's internal paper trail. I still don't know what to make of the Nagell story. If it's true, it's dynamite, unquote. We're going to take a minute to review what we've looked at so far in the discussion of Richard Case Nagell. First of all, we began by taking a look at the discovery of Richard Nagell's body on November 1st of 1995. A fellow tenant had alerted his landlord that Nagell had not been seen for a number of days. The landlord then gained entrance to Nagell's apartment and discovered Nagell's already badly decomposing body. Only the morning before the discovery of Nagell's body, the Assassination Records Review Board had mailed Nagell a letter and was seeking access to documentation he claimed to possess about a conspiracy to murder Kennedy. Although an autopsy performed by the L.A. County coroner indicated that Nagell had died of a heart attack, I would not take that personally as definitive. There are any number of methodologies that have been developed not only by ours but other intelligence agencies to simulate natural death and to be undetectable afterward, including heart attack. So that is something that should not be viewed as definitive, in my opinion. That is to say, the coroner's ruling. Again, we should note that more than a month earlier, based upon testimony of Dick Russell at a public hearing in Boston, ARRB executives had decided to pursue Nagell's private files. Nagell then turned up dead under unexplained circumstances, one of a number of untimely deaths that have occurred in connection with the JFK assassination. We talked about the alleged suicide of William Pritzker in an earlier article. This may very well have been the death of Pritzker may very well have been an assassination. We've also taken note of the fact that there may very well be a number of, quote, evidentiary smoking guns, unquote, including a recording of Nagell and Oswald and two Cuban exiles, anti-Castro Cubans, talking about murdering Kennedy, a possible photograph of Nagell with Oswald in Jackson Square in New Orleans, and a number of other possible pieces of evidence that could confirm Nagell's story. We should note that Nagell maintains that he was ordered by the CIA to defect, quote-unquote, to the Soviet Union, much as Lee Harvey Oswald appears to have been ordered by one or another U.S. intelligence agency, and that he was then assigned by the KGB to monitor Oswald and to monitor anti-Castro Cubans in a possible attempt to assassinate President Kennedy and make it appear as though either the Soviets and or the Cubans had performed the assassination. Nagell goes on to point out, or Dick Russell goes on to point out, that Nagell had alerted both the FBI and CIA about the impending attempt on Kennedy's life. They did not do anything about it. The KGB attempted to do something about it because they had reached an accommodation with Kennedy about the Cuban Missile Crisis and a number of other things. Of course, the assassination went ahead as scheduled. Richard Nagell, in September of 1963, after alerting the FBI and CIA, neither of whom did anything, that is to say, after alerting them about the impending assassination, Nagell fired 2 bullets into the wall of a bank and got himself imprisoned for, quote, bank robbery, unquote. He then continued to attempt to spill the beans concerning what he knew about a plot to assassinate Kennedy, and in vain, it would appear. We should note that Nagell was sentenced to a number of years in prison, then subsequently released in the spring of 1968, and that the Judge Homer Thornberry, who handled his case, was a former Texas congressman, a good buddy of LBJ's, and had apparently been in relatively close contact with LBJ during the course of Nagell's trial. We also took note of a fellow named Eldon Henson, who was monitored by the CIA and was supposedly attempting to work on behalf of Castro's Cuba, and we've seen notations about how useful he may have been. Also, the fact that the code word Laredo was used by some of the apparent CIA handlers who were handling Eldon Henson's case. We have also noted that Henson appears to fit the physical description of someone that Nagell says he was in contact with at the time. The next major segment of the Dick Russell article, Oswald and the CIA, again, this from High Times magazine of March of 1996, and research credit on this, again, goes to a couple of listeners, concerns John Newman's recent book, Oswald and the CIA. John Newman, by the way, the author of a previous excellent book about JFK's plans to pull the United States out of Vietnam. That was called JFK and Vietnam. Russell goes on to describe Newman's efforts. What Newman sets down about the CIA's, quote, paper trail does, in fact, add credence to Nagell's revelations. Here, for example, is the author's summary analysis of the 3 months preceding the assassination. Quote, the CIA was far more interested in Oswald than they ever admitted to publicly. At some time before the Kennedy assassination, the Cuban affairs offices at the CIA developed a keen operational interest in him. Oswald's visit to Mexico City may have had some connection to the FBI or CIA. It appears that the Mexico City station wrapped its own operation around Oswald's consular visits there. Whether or not Oswald understood what was going on is less clear than the probability that something operational was happening in conjunction with his visit, unquote. Noting the possibility of a CIA, quote, renegade faction, unquote, manipulating Oswald, Newman concludes, again quoting, we can finally say with some authority that the CIA was spinning a web of deception about Oswald weeks before the president's murder, unquote, based upon an exhaustive survey of now visible files that were denied to previous official investigations. This dovetails with Nagell's earlier statements that the CIA's Cuban task force, then run by Desmond Fitzgerald, as well as the agency's Mexico City station, were deeply embroiled in the Oswald affair. It also backs up his claim that Oswald did not know who pulled his strings. Newman devotes considerable attention, too, to Jerry Patrick Hemming, whose CIA files bear curious parallels to Oswald's. A former Marine who filed reports to the agency, Hemming claimed to have met with Oswald near the Cuban consulate in Los Angeles early in 1959. Hemming's trail into the Cuban exile community seems to have been followed by 2 CIA employees in Los Angeles, Joseph Devanon, capital D-A, capital V-A-N-O-N, and Ernest Liebacher, L-I-E-B-A-C-H-E-R. Both of their names appear in the notebook seized from Nagell by the FBI in September of 1963 under the heading, quote, CIA, unquote. And again, both of these names were in Nagell's notebook, and apparently they were independently established as pursuing activities along the line of what Nagell claims he was pursuing. Continuing. Also pertinent is Newman's tracing of earlier CIA interest in Oswald from the moment the ex-Marine showed up at the American Embassy in Moscow trying to renounce his citizenship in October of 1959. Quote, I was particularly interested, Newman says, in trying to marshal evidence for Oswald having been a counterintelligence dangle. In other words, the CIA would have been using him to ferret out a, quote, mole, unquote, who was first thought to be in the U-2 program before the focus very quickly changed to their own Soviet Russia division. A mole is a hidden asset of the KGB, such as Aldrich Ames, observing the then top-secret U-2 spy plane program was part of Oswald's mission while a Marine in Japan. Newman observes that the, quote, most pronounced fingerprints, unquote, on Oswald emanated from the CIA's mole-hunting unit, CISIG, run by the late super spook James Jesus Angleton. The existence of Soviet moles inside the CIA was among Nagell's key points about the assassination. He indicated that John Paisley, who was in charge of a CIA unit overseeing Soviet electronics at the time Oswald was employed in a radio factory in Minsk and who died mysteriously in 1978, was one such mole. Nagell also hinted that his own case officer inside the Mexico City station had nefarious ties to Soviet intelligence, which he himself did not discover until the late summer of 1963. This is not to say that the Soviets were behind the assassination, a theory that Nagell adamantly repudiated, but rather that the CIA hierarchy's cover-up of its relations with Oswald related to its ultra-secret mole hunt. Norman Mailer, whose 1995 book Oswald's Tale offers fresh insights into Oswald's time in the USSR, conducted numerous interviews with ex-KGB agents there. After reading Newman's book, Mailer says, quote, I redid a little of my thinking on what the KGB told us. They were very consistent, which made me suspicious as it made me confident. They said over and over they were not interested in Oswald because they had better information on the U-2. Quote, what is he, some kind of exotic Nagell, unquote, they wondered? Did the CIA send him over here as just someone who they, CIA, could observe what's done to him? So we don't do anything to him. We don't debrief him overtly. We don't want to tip our hand, unquote. And Mailer goes on to say, I accepted that when I got to know the KGB and how conservative they were, how terrified of making a mistake. The KGB is seen in America as a tremendous evil, adventurers. Yeah, they had a wing of 100 guys who were daredevils like the CIA, but generally the outfit was exceptionally conservative. But reading Newman, I began to think they were afraid that the CIA was after a mole who was telling the KGB about the U-2. This is something I didn't think of while we were over there. I wish we had. We didn't see all of the KGB files, no question. They didn't reveal a lot to us, saying they were protecting their sources. And there's no question we received an edited version of their files, unquote. Taking up residence for 3 months in Russia, Mailer was granted access to much information gathered by the KGB during Oswald's tenure in the USSR, which his book quotes at length, and proves that Soviet intelligence bugged Oswald's Minsk apartment and maintained constant surveillance of his activities. Mailer believes the KGB, quote, never would have used Oswald. They had too much petty stuff on him. Once you've seen a man losing arguments and being stupid with his wife, it's very hard to pick him to go out and kill a president. In fact, their first fear was that the assassination was a provocation by the United States to start a nuclear war. But I used to quiz the KGB very hard about whether they didn't keep up with Oswald when he came back to the USA. Finally, what they confessed was they didn't have the resources. It was very difficult because their every move here was being watched, unquote. This, of course, does not take into account whether the KGB could have utilized an American double agent like Nagell to keep tabs on Oswald. So again, some recounting of a possible CIA interest in Oswald as a mole, as what is known here as an intelligence dangle, in order to attempt to determine whether the KGB did in fact have a mole deep inside of U.S. intelligence that they were using to gather information about the U-2 project. Recall that Oswald had been assigned to the U-2 project while he'd been in the Marines and while he'd been stationed at Atsugi Naval Air Station in Japan. By the way, at the end of the next segment, we're going to be summing up what we've looked at in this particular article, plus playing a short segment of a cassette documentary tape concerning the Kennedy assassination. That an excerpt from the aforementioned Guns of November program. Please note that these half-hour segments are not available from archives on audio. They are available from a different outfit entitled Spitfire. Their address is P.O. Box 1179, Box 1179, that is in Ben Lomond, California, capital B-E-N, capital L-O-M-O-N-D, zip code 95005. The email address for Spitfire, ALCA alcalame at ix.netcom.com. Once again, alcalame at ix.netcom.com. The address, P.O. Box 1179, Ben Lomond, California, 95005. By the way, a number of listeners have inquired about when I would be doing some writing. I'm in the process of starting my own political journal, and since this hopefully is something that I will be making money from, I can't discuss details on the air. However, those of you who are interested can contact the publication. It's called Other Means, derived from the famous quote from Prussian military theoretician Karl von Clausewitz, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. That is the name of the publication. Other Means can be contacted at P.O. Box 191710, P.O. Box 191710, that is in San Francisco, 94119-1710. Once again, Other Means, P.O. Box 191710, San Francisco, California, 94119-1710. Again, a political journal that I'm in the process of starting. You can also inquire about that via my email address. You can reach me at demory, D-E-M-O-R-Y, D-E-M-O-R-Y, at well.com. Once again, D-E-M-O-R-Y at well.com. Again, for information about Other Means. That concludes this segment. My name's Dave Emory. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and in this next half-hour segment, we're going to continue with an update of new stories, and in some cases, updating of old stories or old investigative avenues vis-a-vis the assassination of President Kennedy. In this update, we're also going to present a new development in the investigation, the ongoing and tortuous investigation into the assassination of Robert Kennedy as well. We're going to begin by continuing with a reading and partial analysis of a very fine article that was sent to me by a listener. This comes from High Times Magazine's issue of March of 1996. It's by author Dick Russell, R-U-S-S-E-L-L, the author of the landmark book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. This is a story, or actually a book about the Kennedy assassination, which centers on the life and operations of Richard Case Nagell, a longtime U.S. intelligence operative who maintains that he was assigned by a KGB contingent that had infiltrated the CIA to assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald before he could be fingered as the patsy for the assassination of President Kennedy, because of the Soviets' fear that the Soviets and or their Cuban proxies might be fingered as the culprits in the Kennedy assassination. Indeed, there was and continues to be a great deal of disinformation pointing in the direction of the Soviets and or Cubans, whereas it's quite obvious that fascist elements within our own national security establishment, in all probability operating in conjunction with an international fascist milieu involving elements in both Asia and Europe as well as Latin America, were the actual authors of President Kennedy's assassination. We have been taking a look at the strange death of Richard Case Nagell, who died of apparently natural causes, although we should note that it has long been an operational capability of not only America's but other countries' intelligence services to assassinate someone in such a manner as to make the death appear to be either a natural death or a suicide or some other form of demise. Richard Case Nagell was going to be questioned by the Assassination Records Review Board, who had taken an interest in his situation as a result of the landmark Dick Russell book. Again, both hardcover and softcover editions, Carroll and Graf Publishers, copyright 1992. That, again, is the Dick Russell book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. The Assassination Records Review Board was going to interview Nagell, had sent him a letter shortly before he was found dead, and then Richard Case Nagell turned up dead in Los Angeles. Another important element of the article that we have reviewed or we have examined in our first two update segments, the previous two half-hour segments, concerns the book Oswald and the CIA by author John Newman. This book is based on recently declassified documents, or features information from recently declassified documents, and it indicates that, in fact, the CIA was very much interested in Lee Harvey Oswald long before he turned up as the alleged assassin of President Kennedy. There is also considerable speculation concerning the possibility of Oswald being a CIA, quote, dangle, unquote, that is to say, a CIA part of a CIA ruse in order to detect a Soviet mole within U.S. intelligence that was, according to some speculation, involved with the CIA's top-secret U-2 spy plane project. Oswald was involved with the U-2. It is now quite well known as a result of the work of not only Dick Russell, but author John Loftus and his cohort Mark Ahrens in their books Unholy Trinity and also The Secret War Against the Jews, that in fact there was a considerable degree of penetration by Soviet intelligence of U.S. intelligence. I think it is a pretty safe bet that the reverse was also the case, or is also the case. Once again, we're going to continue with the article Oswald and the CIA by Dick Russell, the author of The Man Who Knew Too Much. This was featured in High Times Magazine's issue of March of 1996, and research credit on this goes to a listener. Skipping well into the article and resuming after what we examined last. Speaking of not only the John Newman book Oswald and the CIA, but also the Norman Mailer book Oswald's Tale, the author writes, while each of these latest books on the assassination unearths some new ground, particularly Newman's sometimes ponderous but meticulous scrutiny of the CIA's all-too-evident operational interest in Oswald long before November 22, 1963, the real breakthroughs are likely to follow in the coming months from the Assassination Records Review Board. The ARRB ran up against FBI stonewalling last August after voting for full release of 15 records which the Bureau then appealed directly to President Clinton to continue to withhold on, quote, national security, unquote, grounds. The ARRB has come under fire from some assassination researchers for complying with FBI and CIA requests to keep back certain files, quote, relating to sensitive intelligence sources and methods, unquote. Still, what's been publicly released so far, with the promise of much more to come before the ARRB mandate expires late in 1997, has given additional fuel to conspiracy researchers. We now know, for example, that David Phillips, the CIA's covert action chief in Mexico City, was in Washington on October 1, 1963, waiting to pick up, quote, bulk materials, unquote. These probably included manuscripts of conversations between Oswald and Moscow's Soviet embassy, some of which appear to have involved an Oswald imposter. By the way, we dealt with the possibility of an Oswald imposter in Switzerland in the late 1950s in an article that we read, or that I read, in the first of these half-hour JFK assassination update segments. Continuing, and by the way, this next item we are going to take up in greater length, or at greater length in our next segment. We also know that, as early as February of 1961, Phillips, that's the aforementioned David Atlee Phillips, was supervising a CIA operation against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a one-man chapter of which Oswald established in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. Phillips was working in tandem with James McCord, a CIA agent later involved in the Watergate Scandal. As far back as 1976, both Phillips and McCord were cited in cryptic comments by Richard Nagell as having played some role in the CIA's relationship with Oswald. Until a CIA file release by the ARRB last September, the CIA had always refused to acknowledge its use of double agents against the Soviets. However, a November 29, 1963 cable relating to its Mexico City operations states that the CIA, quote, double agents have not had meetings with the Sovs or Soviets since assassination, unquote. This is further substantiation for the agency's utilization of operatives like Nagell. According to Noel Twyman, T-W-Y-M-A-N, a San Diego researcher who was able to speak to Nagell twice over the telephone in the months before his death, he expressed renewed fear for his life, but said his private files were in safekeeping. Nagell added that there are individuals still alive who would be greatly, quote, embarrassed, unquote, in the event his materials should come to light. Two police officers entering Nagell's residence after his body was discovered found no evidence of anything having been disturbed. A number of weapons were inventoried, and the house was sealed off by the L.A. coroner's office, pending the arrival of an executor named by Nagell for his estate. An LAPD officer was said to be watching the house to make sure that nobody broke in. Meantime, a curious message went from the coroner's office to the L.A. public administrator, which is in charge of estate arrangements. Quote, when entering the house, beware of traps, or pitfalls due to deceased's CIA background connections, unquote, it said. Clearly, L.A. officials realized this was no ordinary case. Richard Case Nagell died as he lived, alone and holding his cards close to his vest. The Assassination Records Review Board did make contact with his executor, but what transpired next is being held closely by Washington. Will the world soon know the full story of, quote, the man who knew too much, unquote? For now, it is a waiting game. Indeed, it is a waiting game, and I want to encourage listeners to this program to continue to follow the case of Richard Case Nagell, no pun intended. Again, the book, The Man Who Knew Too Much by Dick Russell, a huge volume, out of print now, I believe, but still available from used bookstores, is a read, so to speak, that is well worth the investment of both time and money. I think it's one of the most important and arguably the most comprehensive JFK assassination book ever. And again, that article, research credit on that to a listener from High Times issue of March of 1996. It's by Dick Russell, the author of The Man Who Knew Too Much, and it's entitled Oswald and the CIA. More concerning release of documents by the Assassination Records Review Board, a small item concerning FBI interest in longtime Warren Commission critic Mark Lane. Mark Lane, the author of Rush to Judgment and A Citizen's Dissent, was one of the earliest and best known of the Warren Commission critics. I think Rush to Judgment is one of the better early critiques of the Warren Report. However, Mark Lane is not an individual I particularly think a great deal of for a variety of reasons, which needn't be discussed in any detail here, his association with the People's Temple being one of those. Following article is from the San Jose Mercury News of Thursday, July 4th of 1996. In its Washington section, we find the following small item. Mark Lane, who transformed himself from an obscure New York State Assembly member into perhaps the most vocal critic of the Warren Commission, was shadowed by FBI agents during appearances dealing with President Kennedy's assassination. FBI files, just released by the U.S. Assassination Records Review Board, show that agents were secretly assigned during the 1960s to attend Lane's speeches on the assassination and report on them to then-Director J. Edgar Hoover. Lane, 69, who practices law in Washington, could not be reached for comment Wednesday. And so, again, there was apparently a considerable amount of interest on the part of the FBI in some of the things Mark Lane had to say. In this morning's San Francisco Chronicle, today, by the way, for the record being July 5th of 1996, the day on which I'm recording this segment, there was yet another story on yet another possible development vis-a-vis the ongoing investigation into President Kennedy's assassination. This was an enormous event and apparently touched a great many lives, and although I personally am very disappointed in the work of the bulk of the JFK assassination research community, which in many ways I think has continued to go over the same ground, although perhaps expanding that somewhat. At the same time, there are a great many researchers who've done terrific work, and the event itself, the assassination of President Kennedy, because it touched so many lives, and because there are so many Americans of sincerely patriotic orientation, that event continues to spark new investigations and new legal machinations. One of those was discussed once again in the San Francisco Chronicle of Friday, July 5th of 1996. The following article is by Michael Taylor of the San Francisco Chronicle. It's headlined, Judge Sues Over JFK Information, subtitled, He Wants CIA to Answer Questions on Mystery Man. The article reads, It was the kind of case any hard-boiled DA or cop might look at skeptically. A Central Valley woman believes her mysterious boyfriend was in a CIA conspiracy to assassinate President John F. Kennedy, and she fears for her life. The boyfriend tells her that Lee Harvey Oswald, the reputed assassin, was just an innocent bystander, and that others fired the fatal shots. Top-secret government codes are found on papers in his house. Evidence about the man's possible complicity in the assassination is given to congressional investigators, and then disappears during a burglary in Washington. The CIA refuses to talk about it. And then, years later, the boyfriend dies of a heart attack just hours before he is to be interviewed by the district attorney and a sheriff's detective. Oliver Stone, where are you? Again, that is in the article itself, more snide editorial commentary being directed towards Oliver Stone, an individual who does not deserve it, and an individual who, along with Jim Garrison, the central figure in the Stone film JFK, well, I believe that both men are genuine American heroes and have not received the credit due them. Continuing. This may sound like the kind of far-fetched tale concocted by wild-eyed conspiracy theorists, but in fact, it is the stuff of a lawsuit filed in federal court in Fresno by a respected Madera County judge acting as a private citizen, one who does not like it when the CIA tells him to get off its case. The judge, who was the district attorney at the time, is David Minier, M-I-N-I-E-R, 61, and he now sits on the municipal court bench in Chowchilla. He gained a certain fame in the 1970s for prosecuting 3 young men who had kidnapped 26 Chowchilla schoolchildren and their bus driver. 2 years ago, using the Freedom of Information Act, he sued the CIA after the agency refused to tell Minier whether Claude Barnes Capehart, C-A-P-E-H-A-R-T, had ever been employed by the CIA, and whether Capehart was in Dallas in November of 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. A federal judge dismissed Minier's lawsuit, but Minier, who was doing all the legal work himself, is appealing the decision to the U.S. Court of Appeals in San Francisco. The judge may be tilting at windmills. Thousands of books and articles over the past 33 years have failed to come up with a definitive solution to Kennedy's death, the Warren Commission's report notwithstanding. By the way, that is less than accurate. In fact, it is quite apparent at this point that there was a conspiracy involving fascist elements within our national security establishment, apparently operating in conjunction with fascist elements abroad in both Asia, Europe, and Latin America, as I've said, to kill President Kennedy. By the way, before we resume with this article, although it appears almost certain that some elements, again, note the use of the term elements of the CIA, were part of this conspiracy, at the same time, it appears that those elements were not operating under the orders of the CIA, and that in fact those elements disagreed with much of the CIA's orientation and fell well to the right of the CIA as a whole, and were operating without the permission of their CIA masters. At the same time, it appears that the agency itself was compromised by the participation of those CIA elements, albeit working under orders not coming from the CIA. I would also note in this regard that the CIA is a relatively small part of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. It only gets 15% of the federal budget for intelligence, and although one hears a great deal about the CIA, other intelligence agencies such as the NSA and DIA are in fact much more important. One doesn't hear as much about them, at least in my opinion. That is to say, I consider them more important. Continuing with this particular article. But Minier says he is suing the CIA to release the Kennedy assassination documents as a way to preserve this, quote, historical research, unquote, on the public record for generations to come. Quote, I wanted to get it into some form of permanent record, unquote, he said earlier this week, again quoting, so that if there's any validity to this thing, then the information will be there as a resource. Anything you file in court is there for all time, and someone may come along who has a lot more ability in doing research than I do, and the material will still be there, unquote. Minier's odd quest about the Kennedy assassination started nearly 20 years ago when Capehart, that's Mr. Barnes Capehart, when Capehart moved to Chowchilla and opened a well drilling business. Soon, Capehart came to the county sheriff's office and said some men had been sent from, quote, back east, unquote, to kill him. Sergeant Dale Forey, F-O-R-E, said he would look into it. But after scouring the dusty Central Valley town, population 6,000, he could find no assassins. But Capehart seemed like an interesting guy to Fore, and soon he was confiding to the sergeant that he had done some work for the CIA. After a while, Fore called a friend at the FBI and asked about Capehart. Both men concluded that Capehart was a fake, but Minier and Fore were later told by a retired FBI agent that Capehart had been employed by the CIA. Capehart had told his female friend that he had once worked on industrialist Howard Hughes' Glomar Explorer, a deep-sea research vessel that, under CIA sponsorship, raised a Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean in 1968. In 1978, Kennedy assassination theories were at such a full boil in the United States that Congress formed the House Select Committee on Assassinations and began digging into tons of muck raked up over the preceding 15 years by dozens of investigators. Back in Chowchilla, Capehart's female friend, who had seen newspaper photographs of possible assassination conspirators being sought by the committee's investigators, came to Fore and said Capehart's face was in one of the pictures. The woman, who still fears retribution and declines to be publicly identified even years after Capehart's death, said Capehart told her he was, quote, in the Texas school book depository when the president was shot, and Oswald wasn't the only one involved at that time, unquote. Fore wrote in his police report, which ended up as part of Minier's lawsuit. She also reportedly said, quote, Oswald was not the person who shot the president. Capehart showed her a handgun with a silencer, automatic firearms, a cyanide pistol, and passports under an assumed name, unquote. Capehart, apparently disturbed by the publicity of the congressional investigation, moved to Pahrump, Nevada to lie low. Then the woman brought Fore a sheet filled with what appeared to be ciphers. She said she had found it in Capehart's papers. Fore added it to his file. So far we have seen allegations brought up to a girlfriend of Mr. Capehart and also to a sergeant on the Chowchilla police force of Capehart's alleged involvement in the Kennedy assassination or events surrounding it. We've also seen the allegation by this lady friend of Capehart's, or former lady friend, that his face was among those photographs being shown as people being sought as possible conspirators by the House Select Committee. Also, Capehart showed her a handgun with a silencer, automatic firearms, a cyanide pistol, and passports under an assumed name. And at this point, things begin to get really interesting. Continuing with this article. Then the woman brought Fore a sheet filled with what appeared to be ciphers. She said she had found it in Capehart's papers. Fore added it to his file. In early 1979, while the House Assassinations Committee was in full-bore operation, Fore traveled to Washington to attend an FBI training course, a routine career assignment for many local law enforcement officers. While there, he called up committee staffers and told them his tale. They seemed interested and took his information, including the cipher sheet. When he finished his training course several weeks later, Fore stopped by and asked to have his evidence back. The FBI agents who had interviewed him at the time gave him some of it, but kept the code sheet saying the ciphers were, quote, classified government codes, unquote. When Fore got back to Madera County, he heard that the committee office he had visited had been burglarized, and the evidence he had given the committee's investigators had been stolen. In July of 1979, the Assassinations Committee concluded that conspiracies were, quote, likely, unquote, in Kennedy's death, but 17 years later, no government agency has confirmed or refuted that conclusion. By the way, I would note that the House Select Committee on Assassinations, although badly compromised, concluded that there was a 95% probability of a conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination, and among other things, they recommended to the U.S. Department of Justice that they investigate David Ferry and the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans. That was the main focal point and the primary focal point of Jim Garrison's investigation in New Orleans. It was Garrison's ultimate vindication, and yet that has continued to be ignored even by many assassination investigators. Continuing. In 1989, Fore and Minier prepared to interview Capehart at his home in Nevada. A few hours before they were to meet him, Capehart, 64, dropped dead of a heart attack. Quote, after he died, unquote, Minier said, things kind of dried up in terms of information, and so there was nothing else to do but ask the CIA about it, unquote. So far, the CIA is saying nothing about Claude Capehart. I would note a number of similarities between this story and the situation of Richard Case Nagell, as related in the Oswald and the CIA article that we read earlier in this series. Note that just before there was to be an interview of Claude Capehart, he died apparently of natural causes. People do die of heart attacks in their mid-60s, as Nagell and Claude Capehart apparently did, and yet it is also a long-standing and verified capability of not only ours but other intelligence services that they in fact can simulate heart attacks and other causes of natural death. Also note the burglary of the office, where some of the information that that Sergeant Fore had given the House Select Committee on assassinations. Also note, too, that apparently the cipher code that Capehart had was of a bona fide U.S. intelligence code. At least that would be the logical conclusion we could draw from the CIA's unwillingness to release it. And there also would appear certainly to be an element of cover-up with regard to Claude Capehart, whatever his possible involvement in the assassination may have been. Note also some of the similarities between that story and a story that I'm about to read concerning new developments in the ongoing investigation into the assassination of Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother. In the Guns of November, as well as Radio Free America program number 9, I have noted the numerous connections between the assassination of Robert Kennedy and that of his brother John, the President. The following story is from the San Francisco Examiner of Monday, June 24th of 1996. This is an AP story by Michael Fleeman, F-L-E-E-M-A-N. It's dateline Los Angeles and headlined, "Trial over RFK photos begins this week." It reads, on assignment for his high school newspaper one June night in 1968, Scott Enyart, E-N-Y-A-R-T, pointed his Nikon at Robert F. Kennedy and saw history through a 50-millimeter lens. Quote, all of a sudden, Enyart recalls, he dropped from the frame, unquote. What Enyart witnessed in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel were the last frantic moments in the life of a man who might have been president. Enyart's photographs could potentially show so much, answer so many questions about a case that has been dogged by allegations of incompetent investigation and cover-up. But the photos, Enyart says, are missing. In a lawsuit against the city that is scheduled for trial this week, Enyart alleges the pictures, among 108 frames of film he says he exposed that night, were either lost or sold by the Los Angeles Police Department. Enyart, now 43 and a special effects man for the movies, wants the city to give his photos back, or at the very least, fork over some of the money he says he could have made from the dramatic images. He accuses the city of putting up 3 decades of roadblocks to cover its actions in the Kennedy investigation. The city contends the pictures exist only in Enyart's teenage imagination, that whatever photos he took at the Ambassador were returned to him as prints. The negatives, the city alleges, were lost in an unfortunate theft earlier this year. On June 5th, 1968, Enyart was taking pictures for the Fairfax High School Gazette at Kennedy's celebration after winning California's Democratic presidential primary. When Kennedy finished his speech in the hotel ballroom, Enyart followed the New York senator into a nearby kitchen pantry. He says he was snapping him in profile when Kennedy suddenly twisted out of the viewfinder and turmoil erupted. Police confiscated Enyart's film. He says it was 3 36-exposure rolls and interviewed the youngster at a police station. Enyart received about 2 dozen prints from the police. None of those photos are among the ones he considers most important, those showing the scene in the pantry immediately after the shooting. He told the investigators he had sealed all evidence in the case for 20 years. Enyart waited until the late 1980s, then requested return of all his photos. Quote, they would at least corroborate or disprove the theories that are out there and, to me, put the whole thing to rest, unquote, he says. These theories include dark suggestions that Saran did not act alone, that a second weapon was involved, that police bungled the investigation or covered up crucial facts. Enyart filed suit, the city said it didn't have his film, and he failed to turn up any trace of his negatives independently. Then, city attorneys reported finding the negatives misfiled under the wrong name in the state archives in Sacramento. They sent Enyart a proof sheet they said was made from the archive negatives and arranged for a courier to deliver the negatives to him. Then, things took a turn for the weird. The courier claimed the package of negatives was stolen from his rental car in Inglewood. Now, all Enyart has left is a proof sheet and a lot of suspicions. So indeed, there are some superficial similarities between the case of Claude Barnes Capehart and the Enyart situation. Note that the information that was the bone of contention appears to have been the focal point of a burglary or black bag job in each case. And once again, note the strange circumstances that continue to surround the ongoing investigations into our political assassinations. The full story of the Robert Kennedy assassination can be gleaned from RFA number 9, the long archive show that I did about the Robert Kennedy assassination. We're going to continue to update the investigation into the assassination of John Kennedy in our next half-hour segment. That concludes this segment. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and in this segment we're going to continue our update of events pertinent to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In particular, in this segment, we're going to take a look at the apparent efforts on the part of elements of U.S. intelligence and the U.S. far right to paint Lee Harvey Oswald red. There is considerable evidence that, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald was a U.S. intelligence operative who was given a left cover for purpose or purposes as yet to be determined. There are a number of theories in this particular regard. It then appears that fascist elements within the U.S. national security establishment, acting in conjunction with fascist elements in Europe, Latin America, and Asia, then utilized Lee Harvey Oswald, an apparent left-cover U.S. intelligence operative, as a patsy in order to effect the assassination of President Kennedy and to effect a cover-up by the U.S. government as a whole in order to avoid compromising U.S. national security methodology. Again, I do not think that the CIA, per se, killed President Kennedy. I don't think that that agency had the power or intent, but I think there were elements of the CIA as well as elements of FBI and other U.S. national security agencies that were involved with the assassination as a part of this fascist cabal, and that necessitated a cover-up by the U.S. government as a whole. In particular, we're going to take a look at the possibility of Lee Harvey Oswald as a left-cover intelligence dangle, so to speak, possibly intended to root out a Soviet mole involved with U.S. intelligence in order to discover more about the U-2 project, the CIA's top-secret spy plane. Another possibility concerns Lee Harvey Oswald's operations in New Orleans as part of a CIA operation to neutralize the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole member of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, whose addresses were shared with the Guy Bannister Detective Agency, an ultra-right-wing detective agency and apparent intelligence front that was involved with U.S. intelligence's guerrilla war efforts against Fidel Castro. In fact, that same building had housed the New Orleans offices of the CRC, the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban umbrella organization. Once again, we're going to examine a couple of items from an article entitled Oswald and the CIA by Dick Russell. This article was in the High Times magazine's issue of March of 1996, and research credit on this goes to a listener. Of the book by John Newman, Oswald and the CIA, and the possibility that Oswald may have been a CIA dangle to root out a Soviet mole with regard to the U-2 project, Russell writes, also pertinent in Newman's tracing of earlier CIA interest in Oswald from the moment the ex-Marine showed up at the American embassy in Moscow trying to renounce his citizenship in October of 1959, quote, I was particularly interested, unquote, Newman says, again quoting, in trying to marshal evidence for Oswald having been a counterintelligence dangle. In other words, the CIA would have been using him to ferret out a mole who was first thought to be in the U-2 program before the focus very quickly changed to their own Soviet Russia division. A, quote, mole, unquote, is a hidden asset of the KGB, such as Aldrich Ames, observing the then top-secret U-2 spy plane program was part of Oswald's mission while a Marine in Japan. Newman observes that the, quote, most pronounced fingerprints, unquote, on Oswald emanated from the CIA's mole-hunting unit, CI/SIG, run by the late super spook James Jesus Angleton. The existence of Soviet moles inside the CIA was among Nagell's key points about the assassination. He indicated that John Paisley, who was in charge of a CIA unit overseeing Soviet electronics at the time Oswald was employed in a radio electronics factory in Minsk, and who died mysteriously in 1978, was one such mole. Nagell also hinted that his own case officer inside the Mexico City station had nefarious ties to Soviet intelligence, which he himself did not discover until the late summer of 1963. This is not to say that the Soviets were behind the assassination, a theory that Nagell adamantly repudiated, but rather that the CIA hierarchy cover-up of its relations with Oswald related to its ultra-secret mole hunt. And still later in the article, Dick Russell discusses another possible use for Lee Harvey Oswald as a left-cover intelligence operative. Skipping down, we read, we also know that, as early as February of 1961, Phillips, that's David Atlee Phillips, the CIA's covert action chief in Mexico City, continuing, was supervising a CIA operation against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a one-man chapter of which Oswald established in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. Phillips was working in tandem with James McCord, a CIA agent later involved in the Watergate Scandal. As far back as 1976, both Phillips and McCord were cited in cryptic comments by Richard Nagell as having played some role in the CIA's relationship with Oswald. What we're going to do next is to listen to a segment of The Guns of November Part 1. That is the first part of a four-part documentary, archive documentary, that I put together in November of 1983 on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. What you're going to hear is not only the Lee Harvey Oswald interview with radio station WDSU in New Orleans, but also the circumstances surrounding Lee Harvey Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. Now, bear in mind that this interview was arranged by Ed Butler, who was working for the Information Council for the Americas, a right-wing propaganda outfit with numerous apparent intelligence connections. The head of INCA was Dr. Alton Oxner, an individual who figured prominently in the 6-part interview that I did with Ed Haslam, the author of Mary, Fairy, and the Monkey Virus, a remarkable book about the Kennedy assassination, discussing possible connections between the assassination and the development of AIDS and a cancer epidemic that is now sweeping, a soft tissue cancer epidemic now sweeping the United States. And again, interested listeners are referred to that series. We're going to listen now to a segment of The Guns of November Part 1 recorded on November 1st, 1983. In addition to my own voice, you will also hear the voice of my former co-host, Nip Tuck, who assisted me with the on-air responsibilities.
Now, recall how when we dealt with the Francis Gary Powers book, Operation Overflight, Powers was the first of many to intimate that Lee Harvey Oswald was basically a Soviet sympathizer or agent who was responsible for downing the U-2 and consequently scotching the summit conference between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. Now, Oswald did indeed emigrate to the Soviet Union. While in the Soviet Union, he got a job at a radio factory, was interviewed by a number of people in the U.S. Embassy, all of whom later turned out to be CIA officials, or agents, I should say. And then, despite the fact that he had supposedly committed treason against the United States and espionage by revealing top-secret information on North American air defenses as well as the U-2's radar situation, that he then encountered remarkably little difficulty in getting back into the United States. He did this, the action of getting Oswald back into the U.S. was initiated through a letter to Texas Senator John Tower, who became chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Oswald got back into the United States, was never indicted or prosecuted for his espionage, and was able to move about the United States rather freely. Now, one of the interesting things is that Lee Harvey Oswald began work on behalf of Fidel Castro, or at least allegedly so. He became not only the head of, but the sole member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee New Orleans chapter, and as it turned out, he was the only member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee New Orleans chapter, but he was not the only person who hung around their headquarters.
Let me stress also this point that Dave is making. Now, on one level, now remember out there, those of you who are not so familiar with some of the subject matter that we're talking about or with the dealings of intelligence, it is very important to remember that the key thing going on here is the difference between reality and appearance. And in this case, Lee Harvey Oswald, who defected to the Soviet Union claiming that he was going to give away all of America's top secret information on air defense and things of this nature, went to Russia, came back, and as a matter of fact, in the process of moving back, I believe he even received a $400 loan from somebody in the government through the State Department to enable him to finish up his affairs and to be able to get back to the United States. When he came into the country, he was never what's called a post-situational interview. He was never debriefed. Thank you very much. He was never debriefed. As a matter of fact, the only person out to meet this heinous defector who'd gone to the Soviet Union, our Cold War enemy, in pitched battle to give them all of our air secrets, the only man out to meet him was a gentleman by the name of Spaz T. Rakin, who was theoretically was a representative of Travelers Aid, but was in fact a representative of several Eastern European violently, almost fanatically anti-communist groups who came out in a very friendly manner to meet this Soviet defector, this pro-Castro, pro-Russian defector, instead of any kind of government official who might want to know what Lee Harvey Oswald had talked to the Soviets about while he was in Russia.
It's interesting, too, that Oswald, the supposed leftist, associated with an enormous number of right-wing people. Now, something we're going to talk about next week and in weeks to come concerns the fact that the address for Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee, recall he was its only member, opened on... It basically was in a building which had another entrance on a different street. One was 544 Camp Street and one was 541 Lafayette Place in New Orleans. I can never remember which was which. Which was the headquarters of the so-called Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and which was an office of a former FBI agent and ultra-right-winger named Guy Bannister.
544 Camp Street was the address on Oswald's literature. And again, we're talking about appearance versus reality. Lee Harvey Oswald had a series of handbills printed up that said the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, of which he was only the treasurer, supposedly, and it had an address of 544 Camp Street. In reality, he may have been the treasurer. He also would have had to have been the president, the vice president, all the members, because as Dave said, he was the only member. And 542 Lafayette Street was the address kitty-cornered. In other words, it was a building on a corner. One corner was 544 Camp Street. The door on the other corner was 542 Lafayette Street. They both led up to a first-floor landing, and the office space shared on that first-floor landing with Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee was the offices of a detective who was a former CIA FBI agent who had many contacts with the anti-Castro Cuban crowd and the Bay of Pigs crowd by the name of Guy Bannister.
None of that, but Guy Bannister was affiliated with Division 5 of the FBI, which is the Internal Security Division. Now, Oswald got in a very highly publicized street altercation with a guy named Carlos Bringuier, who is a Cuban exile affiliated with CIA, and this resulted eventually in an on-air interview between Oswald and a couple of individuals that Nip Tuck is going to tell you about. And this is interesting because this interview certainly laid the groundwork for representing Oswald as a communist sympathizer, if not indeed a Soviet agent, whereas the official version of the Warren Commission's thesis, the Warren Commission thesis was that Oswald was a lone nut. And when the facts of the situation are examined, Oswald's contacts appear to be overwhelmingly not only right, but far right. And it's worth noting here that there was a definite and apparently deliberate effort to represent Oswald as a leftist and to achieve a great deal of publicity with this effort. Okay,
I'm going to be reading from a book entitled Conspiracy. It's by Anthony Summers. It was published in 1980 by McGraw-Hill Books. As a matter of fact, got a lot of very good reviews when it came out. A very scholarly book on the subject of Lee Harvey Oswald and his intelligence contacts.
Summers is a BBC reporter who was commissioned by the BBC to undertake its investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
All right. Once again, reading from Conspiracy and talking first and foremost about a man named Carlos Bringuier, with whom Lee Harvey Oswald had a very publicized shoving match, which enabled him to become known in media circles as a Marxist, because, of course, then he was dragged onto radio programs and interviewed by newspaper reporters, because somebody who was willing to go out in public and hand out handbills for Castro in those days was quite a bit more visible than they would be these days. So once again, that's the first person we're going to be talking about, is this anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Carlos Bringuier. And I read from Summers' book as follows. Carlos Bringuier, the exile in the New Orleans clash with Oswald, certainly had contact with the CIA. He was a New Orleans delegate of the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, the outgrowth of a militant Cuban student group. The group had naturally been deeply involved with the CIA at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and continued to receive funds afterward. The Assassinations Committee found that Bringuier had reported his contact with Oswald to his group's headquarters in Miami, and that the information had in turn been relayed to the CIA. A document obtained from the agency, that's from the CIA itself, reveals that the CIA had, quote, past contact with Carlos Bringuier. Contact was limited to domestic service activities, unquote. As we noted in the case of George de Morenschild's CIA contacts, the Domestic Contacts Division is best known for its efforts to obtain information from travelers returning from communist countries. However, CIA spokesmen have in the past confused inquirers by using that title rather than, quote, Domestic Operations Division. The clandestine department, which by 1963 was conducting secret operations within the United States. Let me go back and just restate that real quickly. The agency's own memos revealed that they had had past contacts with Carlos Bringuier, which they claimed the contact was limited to domestic service activities. However, and I quote again from Summers, CIA spokesmen have in the past confused inquirers by using that title, namely Domestic Services, rather than Domestic Operations Division, the clandestine department which by 1963 was conducting secret operations within the United States. Carlos Bringuier, as New Orleans head of the DRE, also published a right-wing news sheet backed by the Crusade to Free Cuba Committee. The committee was funded by the CIA. It turns out that the agency's fingerprints mark every stage of the process by which Oswald was exposed as a communist. Very little about that, it seems, was spontaneous. First, Carlos Bringuier called William Stuckey, a young reporter who had a weekly radio program on station WDSU. Stuckey went to see Oswald and found him a clean-cut, articulate figure, quite the opposite of the unkempt, wild-looking left-wing prototype he had anticipated. After recording and broadcasting the initial interview, one which he would later recall as oddly, quote, deliberate, Stuckey then began planning a follow-up debate program. What ensued was a classic case of media manipulation for political profit. Stuckey found himself positively showered with information guaranteed to smear Oswald. First, there was a telephone conversation with either the head or the deputy head of the local FBI office, who obligingly read out aloud large extracts from Oswald's file. Thus did Stuckey learn of Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. Soon the industrious Bringuier popped up again, eager to impress similar information on the reporter. He said he had obtained it by sending an anti-Castro colleague to see Oswald, posing as a Castro sympathizer. Finally, the same day, Stuckey received a phone call from Edward Butler, director of a right-wing propaganda information called the Information Council of the Americas, or INCA, I-N-C-A. Butler confided that after telephone calls to Washington, he had confirmed Oswald's Soviet connections with, quote, someone at the House Un-American Activities Committee. The very title, Council of the Information Council of the Americas, speaks volumes for its origins and allegiances. At the time of the Oswald revelations, its manager was a member of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the anti-Castro government in exile created by the CIA.
Okay, now we're in just a second going to play you the interview, a tape of the interview that was conducted by Jim Stuckey, Ed Butler, and Carlos Bringuier with Lee Harvey Oswald on WDSU. Now, before we get into the tape, two details that I'd like to call to your attention, two things to pay close attention to. First of all, in the very beginning of the interview, Lee Harvey Oswald was going to be asked a question about his status, about the status of his citizenship while in the Soviet Union, and his reply is very halting. He stutters, but he initially says that at all times while in the Soviet Union, he was under the protection of the United States government, and then he quickly he hems and haws and backtracks and negates that.
Now, again, just to clue you into this stuff, because it all goes by rather quickly, a very odd thing for somebody to say, or even to claim any kind of connection with the U.S. government for somebody who is supposedly and purportedly defected to the Soviet Union because of his disgust with the United States and with the avowed purpose of giving away America's military secrets.
Also, take note of the fact that Carlos Bringuier, right, the member of the DRE, the CIA-sponsored Cuban student group, that Carlos Bringuier asks a very provocative question to Lee Harvey Oswald. He mentions that Castro characterized President Kennedy as a ruffian and a thief, then asks Lee Harvey Oswald whether he agrees with Castro's characterization of Kennedy. This is worth noting because the tape of this interview that we're going to play was broadcast all over the United States the evening of the assassination. So basically what you're about to hear was heard by all of America on the evening that JFK was assassinated. All
right. So once again, this is William Stuckey's radio interview, and the participants are the people that we have outlined. Carlos Bringuier, an anti-Castro Cuban with CIA contacts. Ed Butler, a very prominent right-winger, later with contacts to the John Birch Society and other groups, also with CIA contacts. And Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of John F. Kennedy.
Stuckey and I are talking with three guests. Lee Harvey Oswald, who is local secretary of a group called Fair Play for Cuba, and with Ed Butler, the executive director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Bringuier, a Cuban refugee and obviously anti-Castro. Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe, Bill Stuckey, you have a question for him.
Yes, Mr. Oswald, I believe you said in reply to a question from Mr. Butler that any questions about your background were extraneous to the discussion tonight. I disagree because of the fact that you refused to reveal any of the other members of your organization, so you are the face of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. Therefore, anybody who might be interested in this organization ought to know more about you. For this reason, I'm curious to know just how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have a government subsidy?
Well, I will answer that question directly then, since you will not rest until you get your answer. I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of that is to say, I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen. I did not lose my American citizenship.
Did you say you wanted to at one point, though, or what happened?
Well, it's a long, drawn-out situation in which permission to live in the Soviet Union granted to a foreign resident is very rarely given. This requires a certain amount of technicalities, technical papers, and so forth. At no time, as I say, did I renounce my citizenship or attempt to renounce my citizenship, and at no time was I out of contact or with the American embassy.
Excuse me, may I interrupt just 1 second? Either one of these two statements is wrong. The Washington Evening Star of October 31st, 1959, page 1, reported that Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine of 4936 Collingwood Street, Fort Worth, Texas, had turned in his passport at the American Embassy in Moscow on that same date and had said that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. Now, this seems to me that you've renounced your American citizenship if you've turned in your passport.
Well, the very obvious answer to that is that I am back in the United States. A person who renounces his citizenship becomes legally disqualified for returning to the United States.
Right, and Soviet authorities, this is from the Washington Post and Times-Herald of November 16, 1959, Soviet authorities had refused to grant it, although they had informed him that he could live in Russia as a resident alien. What did you do during the 2 weeks from October 31st to November 16, 1959?
As I have already stated, of course, this whole conversation, and we don't have too much time left, is getting away from the Cuban-American problem. However, I'm quite willing to discuss myself for the remainder of this program. As I have stated, it is very difficult for a resident, for a foreigner, to get permission to reside in the Soviet Union. During those 2 weeks and during the date that you mentioned, I was, of course, with the knowledge of the American Embassy, getting this permission.
Were you ever in a building at 11 Kuznetskaya Street in Moscow?
Kuznetskaya?
Mm-hmm.
Kuznetskaya is the, well, that would be probably the foreign ministry, I assume. No, I was never in that place, although I know Moscow, having lived there.
Mr. Butler, let me interrupt, and I think Mr. Oswald is right to this extent. We should get around to the organization which he is the head of here in New Orleans, Fair Play for Cuba.
Committee. Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
As a practical matter, Mr. Oswald, knowing, as I'm sure you do, the sentiment in America against Cuba, we, of course, severed diplomatic relations some time ago. I would say Castro is about as unpopular as anybody in the world in this country. As a practical matter, what do you hope to gain through your work? How do you hope to bring about what you call fair play for Cuba, knowing the sentiment?
The principles of the fair play for Cuba consist of restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba. That is one of our main points. We are for that. I disagree that this situation regarding American-Cuban relations is very unpopular. We are in a minority, surely. We are, however, not particularly interested in what Cuban exiles or rightist members of rightist organizations have to say. We are primarily interested in the attitude of the United States government toward Cuba. And in that way, we are striving to get the United States to adopt measures which would be more friendly toward the Cuban people and the new Cuban regime in that country. We are not at all communist controlled, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of any of those facts. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee is an independent organization, not affiliated with any other organization. Our aims and our ideals are very clear and in the best keeping with American traditions of democracy.
Do you agree with Fidel Castro when in his last speech of July 26 of this year, he qualified President John Fitzgerald Kennedy of the United States as a ruffian and a thief? Do you agree with Mr. Castro?
I would not agree. I would not agree with that particular wording. However, I and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee does think that the United States government, through certain agencies, namely the State Department and the CIA, has made monumental mistakes in its relations with Cuba. Mistakes which are pushing Cuba into the sphere of activity of, let's say, a very dogmatic communist country as China is.
Mr. Oswald, would you agree that when Castro first took power, would you agree that the United States was very friendly with Castro, that the people of this country had nothing but admiration for him, that they were very glad to see Batista thrown out?
I would say that the activities of the United States government in regard to Batista were a manifestation of not so much support for Fidel Castro, but rather a withdrawal of support from Batista. In other words, we stopped armaments to Batista. What we should have done was to take those armaments and drop them into the Sierra Maestre, where Fidel Castro could have used them. As for public sentiment at that time, I think even at that time, even before the revolution, there were rumblings of official comment and so forth from government officials against Fidel Castro.
You've never been to Cuba, of course, but why are the people in Cuba starving today?
Well, in any country emerging from a semi-colonial state and embarking upon reforms which require a diversification of agriculture, you're going to have shortages. After all, 80% of imports into the United States from Cuba were two products, tobacco and sugar. Nowadays, while Cuba is reducing its product as far as sugarcane goes, it is striving to grow unlimited and unheard of for Cuba quantities of certain vegetables, sweet potatoes, lima beans, cotton, and so forth, so that they can become agriculturally independent.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Our time is almost up. We've had three guests tonight on Conversation Carte Blanche. Bill Stuckey and I have been talking with Lee Harvey Oswald, Secretary of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Ed Butler, Executive Director of the Information Council of the Americas, and Carlos Brinier, a Cuban refugee. Thank you very much, and good evening.
All right, and that was the voice of Lee Harvey Oswald, as well as the others introduced, and some rather interesting things that we pointed out before, which we hope you got a chance to catch, and some rather interesting things set up for all time. And one, again, cannot help but notice the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist, supposed communist with no organization whatsoever, managed to make his Marxist sympathies and his relationship to the Castro regime and the Russian government awfully well known for a man with a committee of one.
Keep in mind that this interview was in August of 1963, about 3 months before Kennedy was killed, and it was aired, as we said, the evening of the assassination. Everybody heard what you just heard, and, well, what conclusions do you think they were supposed to draw?
That again from The Guns of November, Part 1, from November 1st of 1983. That concludes this segment. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.